Yeah, Tyler, it was a very interesting season for Mineral Point last year. A lot of ups and a lot of downs, starting off the season 0-2 with that loss to Lancaster and then falling 35-0 at Platteville. This season, they will open up the season with both of those teams again from the SWC. They will travel to Lancaster and then host Platteville in week 2. And kind of going to be interesting to see what Mineral Point is this year, especially on offense. On offense, they do bring back their entire offensive line, including last year's SWAL Offensive Lineman of the Year, Matthew Arrett. But besides that, it's going to be entirely new personnel for Mineral Point. A new starting quarterback, a new starting running back, and replacing all 4 starting wide receivers. So there's going to be some questions for Mineral Point to answer on offense. On defense, kind of that same thing. Of their front 7, they're going to bring back 6. And all 6 of those returning players earned all SWAL honors last year. So very solid in that front 7 for Mineral Point. But the entire secondary is going to be new from last year. So kind of wondering what that pass defense is going to look like for the Pointers as well. And just like a lot of the other SWAL teams that we've talked about, they've got a very challenging schedule besides the strength of that conference play. As I mentioned, they'll play Lancaster and they will play at Platteville. But the week in which Mineral Point was supposed to play Abundant Life, St. Ambrose, they're going to take on a team that not a lot of schools in the area see, and that's Lena Winslow out of Illinois. They have won 6 Class 1A state championships in Illinois in the last 15 years. That game is going to be in Mineral Point. So very interesting to see what that game is going to look like and the rest of the schedule as well for the Pointers. Well, a couple things for me. One team that I think is very interesting and that I think is going to improve from last year is Belleville. We've talked about them. They finished 3-4 in the SWAL last year, but they're returning 7 offensive starters and 8 defensive starters. And they talk about some of the depth that they have. So historically, very good athletic department, good football program. So leaning on Riker Swenson and Brennan Keys, it's going to be interesting to see what the Wildcats can do this year. And another interesting thing for me, it's kind of been the story in the SWAL the last couple of years, is what team is going to be able to take on Darlington. They've been dominant in the conference. And we've mentioned the 2 teams coming to mind, Mineral Point and Cuba City. With Mineral Point, they're going to have some questions to answer, like I mentioned, with some of their skill players. But one thing that really stood out to me when I was looking through rosters, last year's all-conference selections, and all of that kind of stuff is I don't know if there's another team in the conference like Cuba City that has such a good balance of having really high-end talent and having depth. And in a long season where all these teams are playing very quality conference and non-conference opponents, I think that's going to be very helpful for Cuba City to have some of that depth to lean on while playing into the strengths of some of their better athletes. So I've got 3 players to watch. My first one is Riker Swenson, a running back and linebacker at Belleville. He was second last year in rushing yards in the conference, and with Ty Chris graduating, he is going to be one of the better running backs in the league this year. Another player to watch for me is Tyson Richard, the quarterback at Cuba City. He finished second in passing yards and passing touchdowns in the SWAL last year behind Gibson Spurley from Mineral Point in both of those categories and very close to Spurley. So he's got a lot of weapons, so it's going to be very fun to watch him. And then one more player for me in a position that doesn't get talked about as much is Jacob Phillips, a middle linebacker at Mineral Point. He is 6'6", very tall, plays center on the Mineral Point basketball team and very talented as well. So I'm going to be interested to watch all 3 of those guys this year. Yeah, I mean, we look at some of the stats from last year, and as Steve mentioned, that wide receiver core really strong, bringing back John Dreschmeyer, also bringing back Wes Krasinger and Michael Esser, all 3 topping the stat list in receiving yards last year. And at quarterback, Bennett Smith, who was the first team all-conference selection in the 8-man Ridge and Valley last year, really strong at quarterback. Also, a lot of all-conference players on defense are bringing back 11 all-conference selections from last year. And the thing that's going to be interesting to see for them is how their playing style is able to translate over to that 8-man, because in some sort of way, it is a little bit different of a game than 11 man, which they're so used to playing. And in a team that likes to pass the ball a lot, they threw for over 1,800 yards last year, 11 or 18 touchdowns rather through the air. And they had a really strong defense as well. They forced 12 fumbles and got 11 interceptions along the way. So it's going to be interesting to see what that transition looks like, but it's going to be really fun to watch Highland compete at the top of the Ridge and Valley in 8-man. Yeah, and so Steve talked about the positive impact that the dual threat quarterbacks have had at Belmont and other 8-man programs. And we saw that last year with Gavin Opitz. He had more rushing touchdowns than he had passing touchdowns. And we really haven't seen a lot of a passing game at Belmont. They focused on their run game last year, and they had a lot of success with it. They had 18 touchdowns on the ground last year. So it's going to be interesting to see how they can continue with that. On defense, not as many takeaways as a team like Highland had. So interesting to see what they're going to look like on defense this year. They do bring back 4 all-conference selections from last year's Ridge and Valley 8-man West League on defense, but going to be really interesting to see what Belmont is this year and if they stick to that ground game that they were successful with last year. It's going to be really interesting to see a bunch of teams in this conference, and how the conferences have changed over the last couple of years, with Ridge and Valley not having that 11-player side to it anymore and getting rid of the West and East and bringing all these new teams together and changing up the schedule. So it's going to be interesting to see what that's going to look like. We've got obviously Highland moving down from 11-man. We've got, in a sense, the birth of a new program this year with Monticello breaking away from New Glarus Monticello and seeing what that's going to look like. So just a lot of questions across the board. It'll be fun to watch it all play out. Yeah, so Tyler, when we were doing our conference previews at the end of the summer, I was really high on Cuba City, and I felt like looking at who they were bringing back and the way that they were going to play, they had a really solid chance to contend with Darlington in the SWAL. And after week 1, I'll admit I had some questions about them, but where I'm at right now, I think it's more of a case of Potosi Cassville is a really, really good football team, and not that Cuba City's a bad team. We saw Cuba City really dominate on offense and defense against Belleville, who played a really close game to New Glarus and a really close game in week 1. And looking at some of the stats for Cuba City, they really did it everywhere. Tyson Richard only had to throw 11 passes, and on those passes, he was accurate, picked up a touchdown. Bradley Rowe, acting as more of a power back, he only had 9 attempts for 37 yards, but he ran in for 3 scores against Belleville. And then also defensively for Cuba City, they had 2 interceptions, so they were able to intercept Sam Arndt once and Brennan Keys once. Brennan Keys, one of the more experienced players with Belleville, but that was Gavin Vossen and Bryce Buxton able to get interceptions and 2 sacks as well. So I think it was really just a good performance for Cuba City all around. And for Belleville, they played those 2 games pretty close in the non-conference, as we mentioned. But now, falling to Cuba City in week 1 of conference play, they're really just going to have to look at their schedule through the rest of the year and see where they might be those games that they can pick up wins and just go game by game at this point. Well, so we'll start with Mineral Point. And at the beginning of the game, it looked like it was going to be fairly close for a little while. It was 0-0 at the end of the first quarter. And I think one really big thing for Mineral Point was injuries. They canceled their JV game this week due to injuries and low numbers. You talk about some guys that didn't play as much. Starting center Colton Docknell came out of the game for Mineral Point, and the quarterback Reed Ackerman came out of the game for Mineral Point. So still trying to figure out their identity. But I think the big story in that game is how good Darlington looked. First of all, with how the coaches were able to handle game planning for Mineral Point, they were able to shut down the Mineral Point run game pretty early. And beyond that, shut down the short passes for Mineral Point. So they were really able to limit the pointers offensively. They also caused 2 fumbles that they were able to recover and intercepted Reed Ackerman once. And all of those turnovers led to scoring drives, and they were able to set up the Redbird offense really well. But if I'm a Darlington fan, the one thing that has me really excited, not only for this year, but beyond, is Zeke Zuberbuehler. And I remember looking at the stats of the first game and seeing he only threw 5 passes. But now, as he moves throughout the season, he's looking much more confident. One drive comes to mind in particular against Mineral Point. He found Maddox Goebel down the field in double coverage for about a 40-yard pickup, and a couple plays later threw a pass over the back or over the shoulder in the back of the end zone to Broker Busher. So very accurate. His ability to run. He would set up a couple rushing touchdowns. So he's going to be really solid going forward, and Darlington is setting themselves up well for conference play going forward. Well, the first team that stuck out to me for the same reasons you mentioned, Tyler, is the Highland Cardinals. Really, really impressive what they were able to do against Belmont. Besides that, I'm going to have to mention Blackhawk Warren, just, losing that first game and bouncing back the way they've been able to pick up wins and getting a win against a quality opponent in River Ridge last week. I'm going to be excited to see what they can do for the rest of the year. Gary, I'm right out in left field with you. I'm also going with Briar Wayne from Basketball. And on top of what you mentioned, he had a successful 2-point conversion attempt and also brought in 6 receptions for 61 yards. So in the receiving game, rushing game, and on defense, he was everywhere. And although it was a loss for Basketball, they put up a fight, and he was a big, big reason why they were in that game.
Great minds think alike, don't we?
I think if we're going to also say that we can have teams tied, Southwestern East Dubuque's got the head-to-head win. Blackhawk Warren has got the win over River Ridge. So while we're at it, and put them both at number 2 for this week, I would put Cuba City at number 4, and I would give them the slight edge over Darlington. That game I have circled on my calendar. That's going to tell me a lot about both of those teams. But as it stands right now, I would give Cuba City the slight edge over Darlington. And then at that 5 spot, take your pick, Prairie du Chien, Darlington.